is. So let's get started. Sorry, I should know a March a year later to share my sound too. Let me click that button. I have that clip. That used to throw me in a panic. Now I'm like, this is just life. Oh, and my internet connection is saying it's unstable. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so civics education is not just about social studies, right? So we're going to be thinking today about ideas that go across our work. But to get us started, here's our team, and I already introduced Brad is joining us today, but we also have Pam and Heather and Sarah and Julie and John and Dana. So as somebody who is living with my husband, but also an almost 3-year-old, I have a daily reminder of imagination, right? You know, anyone who's around children at all realizes that they live equally in the imaginative world, if not more so sometimes, than, you know, the current world that exists right now. And I was reminded of this quote by Maria Montessori, where she said, "Imagination does not become great until human beings, given the courage and the strength, use it to create." And the pieces of this that struck me are the courage and strength piece, but also the create piece. And so a favorite activity in our house is building with blocks, right? Those basic unit blocks, right? And there's so, I mean, we could spend the whole time just talking about blocks. I could spend the next 3 hours just on that. And certainly so could many of you on this call, I realize. But there was this one particular piece that I wanted to draw attention to, which is when my son plays with blocks, he does take time to sort of imagine what he wants to create, right? And he has the courage to start. But he also has the courage to knock it all down, right? The kaboom that happens is just as exciting, right? And just as important as the building. And so some of what we're going to talk about today is like, can we even recognize the blocks, right? The pieces that we have as leaders and educators. Some of what we're going to talk about today is having the courage to build something. And some of it is going to be the courage to say kaboom, right? And knock it all down and start anew. And so I have this daily reminder getting to watch a 3-year-old do this. But in a lot of ways, when we are called to do this work and we are not sure what to do, maybe we have to look even more closely at what the children in our communities and our schools are doing. And you're going to see that also throughout our time together. If we listen to children more, they have the answers to many of the questions that we're seeking. So we're going to take the courage and strength and willingness to say kaboom of children. And then as someone who's not always a Kurt Vonnegut fan, this quote really struck me when he said, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be." And so I think about the ways in which, when we again look at children, like Leo is not pretending to drive that bug and fly that bug. If you were to ask him, he is actually flying that bug, right? That the line between pretend and real, right? And so like I'm reminded of teacher Tom and others who write about this idea of like, instead of asking students like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's like, well, what are you doing right now? And it's the way we call kids readers the second they enter our classrooms. They're not pretending to read, they are reading, even if they haven't read every word or mastered every phoneme or understood the phonetic principle yet, right? That there's this way in which what we pretend is who we are. But there's another layer to this that I wanted us to acknowledge and start with today, which is how much of school is a bunch of pretend. And I'm just going to name that. Like, how often are we playing roles or stepping into roles that we've inherited from others because we think that's what a good teacher or a good leader or a good learner or a good friend or a good colleague does, even when it isn't who we really are? So is it when somebody says something that actually might have a racial undertone that we're uncomfortable with, but we remain silent and we pretended that it was okay or that we didn't hear it? Or when we hear somebody say things about students through a deficit lens, that hurts our very soul. But instead of saying, that's not okay, right? We instead redirected the conversation, right? Every time I have done that, I am pretending, right? And so there's also ways my pretending has been great for me. Like the first I stepped into an 8th grade class to model an 8th grade lesson, and I've never been an 8th grade teacher. I was pretending I knew how to be an 8th grade reading teacher, right? And there was this way in which I pretended it until I was, right? And so we all are pretending our way into things all the time, sometimes because we sort of pretend our way into positions that empower us and others around us. And sometimes we pretend in ways that are actually really harmful because we pretend not to see or we pretend to look in the other way. And so, like, this to me ties into this idea of imagination. And so I have two questions here, right? So, this idea of having us really ask ourselves, like, what are we creating, right, with the blocks that we are given, right? And also the other question, which to me is a much more vulnerable one, like, what are we pretending to be? So we're going to do a quick waterfall chat. If you don't know what that is, we're going to each type in our response to one of those questions and then don't hit send yet. And we'll all hit it at the same time so we can sort of flood all at one time. So it's a little bit less vulnerable than like who wants to go first with this, right? So either this idea of in your role, what are you creating or what are you pretending to be? I will do it also. So pull up our chat, take a moment to reflect on this, but don't hit enter yet. Okay, are we ready? So on the count of three, we'll all just hit enter and just like let it be what it is for right now. 1, 2, 3. We'll just take a moment to look. Yeah, and sort of just the power in naming it, of asking the question and naming it. And what would it be like if the teachers that you support, if you asked them these questions, right? What kind of answers would you get? And especially I feel like the creating one, like the reason I didn't answer that was like, to be honest, like I don't know. I feel like I need more like I know what I intend to create, but what am I actually creating? Like I feel like sometimes like I need more information around that. And the pretending one, you know, I feel like it's sort of endless. There's so many ways. Like I appreciate people saying like I'm pretending to be comfortable in situations I'm not. I'm pretending to have control over things that I don't. And what's the power of naming that, right? So I'm going to invite us today to acknowledge the places we're pretending. I'm not going to say that we're not going to be like we're going to use our imagination. So it's full of pretend, right? But also recognizing that like there's so much that we don't know and there's so much possibility that we could be creating and that's okay too. So to build on from this, um, I really think it's important if we're going to talk today specifically about civic education to start our day also listening to students. And Dana will bring the voices of students back later in our day together too. So I was just thinking about what are some of the topics that keep me up at night and what do students have to say about them. And it's actually not that hard to find student voices. And in fact, in your own buildings, hopefully you're listening to student voices. But I want us to hear just a few students and a few different modalities of what they have to say right now. through this lens of civic engagement.
One of the questions the students have is like, why doesn't anyone care and why doesn't anyone do anything about this climate change business? And as a student, what guidance would you give them?
As a student in Alaska, we are actually trying to find solutions, trying to find actions, resolutions, any acts to try and combat climate change. That's what the whole reason COP is for. That's what we're here for.
Right.
We're trying to tell our story and trying to tell the world leaders that we need a change right now.
Yeah. Do you think that through personal stories, do you think that that is a way for kids to be listened to?
Yes, the youth are very important because we're the future of the world. We're the future leaders, and telling our story, our personal story, depending on where you are, it just makes it a lot more inspirational and more helpful for these current leaders to hear these stories. It just really helps.
So I appreciate hearing directly from a student about an issue in Alaska around climate change. And I also want to name to me how silly this video was. And you might not, but she's asking him, like, do you think anyone cares? And he's hosting, as a high schooler, a conference on climate change and what can be done. And she's framing it, asking him, like, well, like, and he's like, yeah, I could be a future leader, without recognizing he is a leader right now. He has an issue he cares about. He has a platform. He's a part of a conference. He's speaking about it and he is being interviewed. And so to me, like, there's power and he has something to say, but also, like, how are we minimizing like the very real contributions, like right now in this moment, of the students in our communities? And then I was struck by, when I started to look at other issues that I know are coming up a lot in classrooms, and this was even prior to what happened on Monday with yet another mass shooting, but this high school student in Colorado saying, you know, Colorado tends to suffer more than many places with mass shootings. Like, we need policy change. But most young people, often the direct victims of gun violence and our country's lack of gun control, aren't old enough to vote. The people creating gun legislation have no idea what it's like to crouch in the corner and pray that the classroom door doesn't open and a shooter walks through it. As much as we're desperate for change, our voices can't yet be represented. And so what struck me about this one in particular is how the student is naming that even the very issues that affect their daily lives, most students don't have a real say in. And so that is another piece that I said, gosh, we have to do something about. And then I started to look at the Black Lives Matter movement and how much of that movement is actually directed, right, and led by youth. And a student who's 14 in New York, in an essay contest, this is simply what she said: we are the change that we want. And she was surrounded by others who talked about they are no longer looking to the adults in their communities to create the change, that they have come to the conclusion that they themselves, as a 14-year-old, are the key change maker in what's going to happen. So I say this to just offer a few perspectives from students of like how we are doing such small amounts and big amounts of work to amplify voices of students, and yet how often it comes across as pandering and small and minimizing what they're actually doing. Like, these small little things aren't enough, right? And you're going to see that in many ways through what we talk about today. Oops, so I'm interested in why and what we can do. So there's this term adultism that you may or may not have heard about. If you've never heard about it before, we'll make sure we share the slides. And if you click on this slide, it will take you to the full article by John Bell. Now, there's many pieces that have been written about adultism, but not enough. The concept is basically this simple: that adultism is like many of the other isms, where adults think they are better than children, and therefore they can make all of the decisions, direct the lives of, and treat children as less than fully formed humans. And I put this one example in here because I thought it was really helpful. He calls it a mirror to recognize when adultism is happening. And if you look at this list of questions, you know, would I treat an adult this way? Would I talk to an adult this way, right? Would I limit adults' behavior in this way, right? Would I listen to an adult friend's problem in this way, right? Like that sometimes the ways in which we are silencing students is big and systematic, but sometimes it's in our very way that we frame our view of students, and how every way that we interact with them is a way in which we could be sending them the message that their voices don't matter, right? And we're also going to hear throughout today from Izzy Tahid, who is a teacher in the Bronx, who is a Heinemann Fellow, who I got to know through the Literacy Consultant Coalition, who is a phenomenal educator. And she says, we resort to control when we don't have relationships. And I think about this prior to COVID, but how much COVID has amplified that sometimes when we're seeing this extreme, like wanting more and more and more control, what we actually need to be helping teachers see is what you need is more and more and more relationship. So to wrap up my portion of this and get us ready for the rest of the day, I want us to think about some what ifs. And again, this is a question we'll come back to. So if you don't know Teacher Tom, I highly recommend you follow his blog. If nothing else, you might not agree with everything he writes. He is extremely progressive educator, but he will always push me to think in ways that are way beyond what I normally am thinking. And he had this post back in 2009, what if children had the right to vote? And again, if you click on this slide later, you can get the full article, and you can also, get into the deep world of Teacher Tom blogs. But I do want us to just consider this for a moment. He says, children are also the only category of people who were denied the fundamental right of citizenship, the right to vote. It might at first sound like a ridiculous idea, granting voting rights to children. After all, they aren't mentally fully developed, so how can we expect them to think rationally enough to vote? Of course, this is, in a nutshell, the same argument that was historically used for denying women and people of color the right to vote. It was a ridiculous idea because they simply didn't have the brains or temperament to participate in public life. And as for thinking rationally, we don't deny adult citizens their right to vote if, say, they become senile, develop mental illness, or otherwise mentally disabled. Indeed, I might even argue that anyone who doesn't vote the way I do is voting irrationally, but that doesn't mean they should be disenfranchised. Voting is about representation, not rationality. Children are citizens who, like women and racial minorities, don't necessarily see the world the way the majority does. And if their perspective isn't included, democracy isn't going to work. History shows us that those whose voices are not included are invariably the ones who are also poorest and most likely to be exploited, which is exactly where we find ourselves today. So Teacher Tom in this full post, nor am I saying like, yes, like students should have the right to vote. Like it's not about coming to a quick answer on these things. It's, are we even imagining that? Right. And he spends his post sort of diving into like, what would it be like in a world where students actually had a right to vote for things? And there are schools where there are one human, one vote, where the adults don't have any more power than the children in those schools. Those are often usually independent schools, not public schools, but they certainly exist. They're not abundant yet, but they are around, and probably not even as far as you would think. So I'm going to invite us, before I pass the baton on, to just sort of take a few moments here to imagine, right? Imagine for a moment, what if students were treated as real decision makers in the schools? And so here are 3 scenarios. Just pick one to spend a little bit of time thinking about. What if the school curriculum was created by the students? What if the schedule was completely revised by students, or even that matter by teachers, because we know teachers in many places are also not treated as decision makers? Or what if the new teacher being hired for the school was chosen by the students? And I don't mean like they're on the committee and get a vote, but nobody listens to them, like truly chosen, right? So take a moment to figure out like which one of these is most compelling for you to think about. And I'm going to put us in a very quick breakout group for just a couple of minutes. The only goal is to use our imaginations together. So just, you're going to share with your group. Here's the one that I'm thinking of course, introduce yourself, right? I'm working on A, B, or C here, right? Curriculum, schedule, or hiring a new teacher, and just spend some time imagining. I'll bring us back in a couple minutes, and then we'll build from there. Okay, my own self got cut off, so that's funny that that warning is like, just ignore that, and I think that I have like some special powers to that. So to be continued with my group at least. So just to sort of bring us back together after that, I know that wasn't a lot of time, but we will have plenty more time together throughout the. Dana, can you share your screen now? Sorry, I'm having an issue with mine all of a sudden. Thank you. So just to sort of bring us together, I'm wondering, and no one needs to sort of call themselves out on this, but how much of what you imagined was the past and not the future? And so how much of our obstacles to imagining what could be better is grounded in like, but here's what we did. Because I'll say in my group, including me, we really talked about like, here's what we've done, not here's what we could do. And so like, how can we today continue this idea? Of course, we want to look back, but how do we also give ourselves permission to look into the future and to create something that could be bigger and bolder and more relevant? And to just go to one more slide to sort of set the context for how we want to have these conversations throughout our time together. I'm drawn to Glenn Singleton's work. If you don't know his work on Courageous Conversations about Race, it's really, really important work. And I'll just say, he talks about these like community commitments of how we want to be in conversation today. And so I'll ask us to stay engaged, right? And I know that that means different things for each of us, whatever that means for you. To expect to experience discomfort. We can't talk about civic engagement without talking about patriarchy and white supremacy and racism and anti-racism. And we can't talk about it without talking about things that we have done that have totally failed, right? And our own blind spots, right? And so like there's a way in which like this, you know, is going to be uncomfortable, right? Potentially. Speak your truth. And what I mean by that is to not speak another person's truth, but your own. So to avoid universal statements like we or as people, like to speak about your experience, not a collective experience, and expect and accept a lack of closure. I think this one can be really hard, but Brad has always been good at this for as long as I've known him, like that we're not going to necessarily tie our day up together today in like a neat bow, like we figured out everything about coaching and supporting teachers around civic engagement, like of course not. So we might leave with more questions than answers, but we'll have hopefully a different set of questions that we're pursuing. So we'll be moving and growing, but maybe not having closure on this topic today. So with that being said, I look forward to the rest of our time together. I hope we're already sort of in an imaginative role, and I'm going to pass it on to, I think, is Sarah going next?
Yes. Thanks, Gravity.
Right, thanks.
So thinking a little bit about what Gravity mentioned and setting up sort of how we might frame our time together today, we're going to be kind of reflecting, collecting, learning, and exploring in sort of these two parts that she mentioned. And so in just a moment, we're going to spend a little bit of time sharing our stories and perhaps thinking back on ourselves, what we experienced and perhaps learned about or through civics in our own lives. And so then we'll kind of set ourselves up for a little bit of work and conversation around that, and then also step into the work together to look ahead and imagine some possibilities. And so by kind of starting here with story and sharing our experiences, we're doing just that, right? We're speaking our truth. We're speaking from a point of experience of our own. And we're looking at one another and connecting with one another through our human experience of story. And so that made me think a little bit about how even this work together today, this time together, is we're fusing new relationships and we're sort of firming up the corners of our life that help us build the capacity for this work. And so allow me to just take a moment to share a little bit of my own story with this sort of civics mindset. And so in planning this day and in thinking about this day, I had to do a little bit of reflection work of my own. And luckily in my basement, I had this old sort of scrapbook that I had put together, I think in 7th or 8th grade for a school project. And a couple of images popped out in memory and mind for me. So I'm just sharing 3 here as sort of the backdrop and thinking and looking back on my own civics experience. So the first thing that really struck me was this captured moment from kindergarten graduation, cap and gown and all. And the surprise that I was given this sort of citizenship award. And I think at the time in the moment, I didn't really understand fully what that meant, but I knew it was a good thing, that it had something to do with sort of like kindness and goodwill towards others. And then kind of skipping ahead a few years, thinking about early elementary, here I am at this, brownies ceremony as part of a Girl Scout troop. And I do really have sort of fond memory and recollection of the experiences that we had in sort of taking care and responsibility of our community and ourselves, and this sort of project orientation in my life, project-based sort of charitable work, which then if I skip ahead a little bit further along that continuum, I'm thinking here a little bit about sort of this career ed program that was hosted, I think it was like 4th or 5th grade. And I was so excited because for those of you who know me, my dad was an Eastern Orthodox priest. And for me, growing up in Western New York, that felt like a very unique experience, sometimes isolating as a young person. But to be able to invite my caregiver, my parent, my father in for him to talk about his role in the community, his job, his occupation, really just felt like such a pivotal moment for me. And so, in looking back at these experiences, I realized whether there was an overt or sort of like a subdued, quiet civics mindedness developing there, I stopped and I thought to myself, why did all this matter? Why did these sort of small moments, these ordinary and somehow traditional things that happened to me, what do they speak to? What's important here? And I think for me, in looking back, whatever that civics experience was like, is it allowed for me to sort of honor myself, the person that I was growing to be, and to also look outward at the humans around me in my community. And so perhaps as we step into sharing our own stories and the collecting that you might do, one thing you might want to think about as well is, what was the sort of undercurrent of those experiences? What did it mean for you as a person in your own identity, in your community, and so forth? And so moving to the next slide, thinking a little bit about this work, we're going to take a moment to set up our own learning notebooks. And so knowing that this is sort of the framework for today of looking back, collecting, reflecting, and then also imagining and looking ahead, take a moment to decide, how do you want to capture this thinking? And there are just a few offerings here for you. Maybe it's sort of a 2-part notebook entry, thinking back, imagining ahead. Maybe you're more of a sketch note kind of person who wants to storyboard those civics moments and memories for yourself. Or maybe this heart map idea speaks to you. Because in just a moment, we're going to take just a quiet minute before we go back to breakout rooms to continue building our relationships and our connection through story, to really grow our own capacity for this work. So take a moment to decide, how do you want to set that up? And then Dana, if you could just bring us to the next slide. Here's what we want to take our quiet moment to reflect on before we share our stories. So think back to what was memorable in terms of civics at school. What were those explicit or implicit messages? And in what spaces were you developing this awareness? And thinking broadly in that way. So let's take a quiet moment to do just that. All right, so wrap up your reflection, and we're going to get ready to go into some breakout rooms to share our stories. All right, so welcome back, everyone. So hopefully you were able to look back, reflect, share a little bit of your own story around civics. And what we're going to do next, so keep that notebook handy and nearby, because we're also going to do a little bit of thinking and learning in the next two parts with the help and guidance of Brad and John to think a little bit now. And this hopefully will help us start to imagine or reignite our imagination fires, to think a little bit about sort of the various schools of thought around civics, some of the barriers, and then certainly what are our roles in schools inside of that work. So I'm going to pass things over now to Brad as he guides our next little bit of thinking.
Sure. Thank you so much. This all started one day. I had this thought coming home from work and about how could we reimagine civics, and I decided, who's the best person I can call to start this conversation? And it started with a 2-hour conversation I had with Gravity in the parking lot of a Starbucks a few months ago, just thinking about who would be the right audience to have this conversation with. And everything to this point so far has really addressed many of the issues and concerns that I have. And it's funny because people, the title of this is, civics is not in the social studies only, but I'm the person who's coming in from the social studies angle here. So just take a look here at these 3 branches to orient our civic experience. We have our traditionalists, our pragmatists, and our reconstructionists. And this is just a really important way to orient the subject for us as we think about our own experience in school. Most of us, where do we land our experience so far from the school level? Probably on that top rung, which is a little bit longer there. So when we think about our civic education in terms of our classroom experience and in the school, most of it's rooted in traditional ideas, grounded into our traditions and structures. When we think about civics, even looking at Sarah's experience as a young child, through the brownies and the kindergarten graduation, it's all rooted in liberal philosophy, not liberal political ideas, but liberal philosophies that started from the ancient Greeks and ancient civilizations about the formation of democracy. And most of our conversations around civics really stem from the Constitution and understanding of the branches of government. There is this focus on historical evolution, looking at evolution as a key to understanding history, that we have evolved. And Gravity touched upon that when she shared with us this evolution of the right to vote. It's looked at a story of progress. We initially disenfranchised, millions and millions of people, more than half of our population. Certain minority groups have been brought into the fold, but now we look at children maybe as the next group that we're targeting to bring voting rights to. But in general, when we look at civics, it's from this story of progress and the evolution of our history. And then there's a clear hierarchy in terms of our roles across society. So all of this here is rooted in traditional theory and traditional history and our structures and our existing processes that we use within the government. And it's very much oriented in Constitution, our US Constitution, other founding, quote unquote, documents that have governed us to this point. Something that's very distant for students, for communities, and people that typically make the civic education that we live in. And I think it's also important when we look at that traditional sort of orientation that we think about those implicit messages or those implicit experiences that through the questions that were asked so far have really got us to think about not just the formal curriculum, but that hidden curriculum that is so much rooted in patriotism and other ideas that are reflected in the school. And I think going into the next level of orientation, there are two distinct departures away from the traditional model. One is from the pragmatists, really from the field of study of John Dewey in the progressive era, and then the Reconstructionists. And there's been a back and forth, and these are the more progressive orientations towards civics. However, there are two distinct branches. The pragmatists are looking for ways that the school could mirror society so that students get the experience to participate in the classroom, in the school, in a way in which citizens outside of the school practice. And this is really what John Dewey tried to create in his lab schools in the early 1900s. And it was very much part of the progressive movement. So what you see now this look like is, study of different issues like environmental issues or social issues, debates in the classroom, student government. It's a way to mimic what's happening in society so that students get that experience. But a more radical idea, and one that I think came through the questions that Gravity asked in the beginning about what would happen if students made the curriculum, what would happen if students hired the teachers. Really, the Reconstructionists believe that the school is the engine for change. So the things that are happening in society, the ideas, the creations, are actually done through the schools. And this is reflected through social activism, shared decision-making, having kids do action research, taking sort of an educated stance or research on a topic and then being able to act upon it. Really creating critical narratives that become prominent across the discourse in the school. And you see definitely a tension even in the progressive field between the pragmatists and the Reconstructionists. And for many of, I work in a public school and many people do, we live in the traditional model of civics and we maybe enter into the pragmatic world. And then we hear about the Reconstructionist world when we look at these independent schools. So if you could do the next slide, thanks. So the other piece here is how is civics, how has it been conceived in schools? And this is something that I've studied and I've taught as a former civics teacher, and I've worked with in-service and pre-service teachers at the graduate level. And I really couldn't figure out the best way to represent this. So I just made a little word tool that I put together using a symbol and just some key terms and topics that come across. It has been a very limited scope when we look at the formal civics curriculum. 3 branches of government, I put 1776 up here, voting, John Locke. First of all, it's very nationalistic. It's not local and it's not global. It's very much looking at the state and the national government. And it's really looking at a narrow set of principles and a narrow set of histories. And I think, if you go to the next slide, because there's not much else to say, what are the barriers to this broader conception? And I think that is where I'm having a problem and why I initially went to Gravity and really feel that this is an issue that must be pressing today, because the question today is not, is civics going to become part of our formal curriculum? I think that we are at a point now where most people in educational policies making, in schools, in society, feel that there is a crisis with our schools when it comes to civics. That what we see around us today, if we were to try to address the problems, this distance between individuals and how divisive people are and how misinformed they are and how much incorrect information is out there, there is definitely going to be this movement towards let's bring civics back to the school and really focus on it. And this is the reason why I'm very concerned, is that we are just going to get more entrenched into that traditional model where we say everybody's got to know the Constitution back and forth. Everybody's got to be able to understand the history of our government and its systems. And those are not necessarily bad things. And what I've realized as a teacher formerly of the social studies, we have these tremendous examples of students being civic actors, things like National History Day or We the People competitions, which I've judged, where kids are so knowledgeable about the Constitution and its application and really understand the role of citizenship, but is really only accessible to a few. And it's also very divorced from real experience or real decision making. And if we go to this pathway where we can agree that civics is going to become a priority in the school, much like STEM did 10 years ago, and like literacy is for all of you, I'm very worried about it just becoming entrenched into the system that has so long existed. And I think that we, in order to make it better, need to evaluate not just the classroom and the students, and but also the school and its relationship to the community. So, here's some of the barriers that I would say are problematic. We have these entrenched beliefs, and in some cases, non-existing beliefs about civics. We have these very hierarchical systems that are put in place. And if we're going to teach kids to be active citizens in the school, we have to reflect that in some way, and how schools are run, and how the voice and the involvement of students. And I think that's where Gravity's whole discussion about adultism was very interesting and also new for me. We live in this world where there's a great deal of misinformation and mistrust. I'm now to the point of thinking that, on every side of the issue, it's actually, people are less open-minded now, even though they have so much more access to information and ideas and are interacting more. I mean, not maybe now during this COVID time period, but this is a period where there's such mistrust in individuals and groups. I think the lack of imagination. I think when we think of imagination, it's not usually linked to civics. And that's why I'm pushing this broader conception. It's usually linked to the arts. It's linked to even science and reading and writing. But to what extent do we really utilize our imaginative abilities when it comes to civics? And I think, just the willingness to stick to the status quo, which is very common for schools in general, it's often a trap we fall into. And then the last point here is usually, I think that the phrase is the inability to see the forest through the trees. I think this is the opposite. It's the inability to see the trees through the forest. So we look at that last slide where you have those sort of big principles and ideas, but looking at the person, the identity of each individual, looking at their story, being able to see an issue that might be a global issue, but how do you see it in your own family, in your own community that you live in? I think that has been a barrier. Everything that has been presented as a civic idea typically has this sort of national orientation towards it. So the last thing I'll say here, if you could just go back, I'm sorry, did I get the hook? You're out. The National Council for the Social Studies and many other social studies organizations and even school missions state our goal as a school system is to create informed, active citizens. And it is often the mission of public schools. And how much time do we actually put towards that? So what I would say is we need to rethink what informed means. And I think, again, going back to some of the previous people speaking, I don't know if we really even know what kids know now about being civic actors. I think they know a lot more than we think they know, and there's a lot we can learn from them. So this whole idea of what it means to be informed is very different. We need to rethink what it means to be active, and we also need to rethink what it means to be a citizen, because I think these are all terms that we all agree are important to civic education, but I don't know if we've really reflected and studied and better understood the meaning of each of these terms. So now you can give me the hook.
No, Brad, that was a really important orientation for all of us, right? To kind of see those frameworks, to imagine those pathways, and then also to think a little bit about those barriers. And so before we really bring it even closer into sort of like our interior life as coaches or leaders or individuals who work inside of schools, we're going to just pause here with our learning notebook nearby to now having that orientation, thinking about those barriers. What are those characteristics of democratic spaces? And I want to invite everyone in just a moment, or as I'm sharing, to jot some things that are really striking you here in terms of these characteristics. We can't be all things at all moments in time, but one way to look at this is to perhaps think about which of these characteristics seem to be alive or living, and which ones really draw you in or make you curious, give you pause, and help you imagine something more for that rethink work that Brad was sort of challenging us to imagine, right? Rethinking informed, rethinking active, rethinking citizenship. So allow me just to kind of name a few here that I feel are a little more nuanced for us. So when I think about these characteristics, one that stands out to me is the sort of collaborative nature, right? Because that's really multifaceted. Inside of democratic spaces, there's this sense of collaboration. And so what that could mean is shared ownership. But it's not just the owning, it's also the identifying of problems together, the coming up with solutions together, the sharing of the accountability and the care. And so collaboration is really important here. Another that maybe needs a little unpacking is sort of this contributory characteristic of democratic spaces, right? I guess thinking about individual wisdom and experience that, for example, Brad was just nodding to, like, what do we know? What do we bring? What do students bring? So individual wisdom, individual experience, and certainly individual talents and abilities that we are inviting into the space. Another characteristic worth dwelling on maybe is that sort of intellect or intellectual nature of democratic spaces, the ways in which we're building and integrating knowledge, right? Knowledge is not just for knowledge's sake, but once we have that knowledge, what are we learning about? What are we learning from? How are we looking at the past and the present? And not just the things that we're learning, but also that which must be unlearned. And the unlearning can sometimes feel like much trickier, harder work than the new learning work. And then last, I'll just briefly mention criticality here. And I feel like it really ties to that intellectual nature of democratic spaces. What are we doing with our learning, with the reading, the writing, the creating, the speaking? Is there a sense of urgency and immediacy that's coming to life so that we can support our community and so that we can move ourselves perhaps towards this reconstructivist or reconstructionist approach that really is about leveraging the power of many, and it comes down to liberation work. So just take 30 seconds, jot some words in your notebook that are striking you, ideas that feel like they're part of your now imagined sort of social experience, civics experience. All right, so John's going to help us explore and reflect and dig even a little bit deeper now to think about our roles and identities inside of schools as democratic spaces. So on to John.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, that was really helpful. Both Sarah, you were talking about this idea of unlearning. That's really a big piece of some of the folks that I look to get some inspiration for what roles might I play in classrooms and supporting teachers and supporting children. And then Brad, your idea of this idea of trees from the forest, and I thought, I'm really looking forward to going into the forest then to to see what opportunities are there for this for us to support teachers and to support children. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is this idea of partnership and our partnership with children. And so as educators, to consider what is our partnership. If we're looking to raise free people, we're looking to be in community with them, we need to look at ourselves in some way as being partners in that way. So a lot of my examples of how to do this work, I was unclear about. I've had some mentors and examples within the school system, But some of the clearest examples I've got of how to be partner with children and help children step into and initiate themselves into community have been from people outside of school. Some people from unschooling movements, democratic education movements, as well as some of the earth-based education that I've experienced. So I just wanted to share a few of those things to consider, to imagine what do these people who have done some of this work offer us in terms of reimagining how we might be in classrooms and in the spaces of democratic spaces. So I wanted to share a little bit from Akila Richards' work. Her work is as unschooling her children. And I just want to read this quote from her book to give you a little bit of a sense of her work. To raise my children as free people, I need to be versed in freedom. I need to recognize it, know when it is threatened, and trust myself to act on what I know. If I viewed my children as fertile land to shape and design without the partnership of their own choices and curiosities, then I would be colonizing that land, those children. I would be the oppressor. If I'm ignorant to the harm I'm causing, then I will keep causing it. And in her book, she talks about her unschooling experience with her children. And a lot of it isn't just what did she do to support her children. Well, it is a lot about that, but a lot of that is about her internal journey, the questions that she asked herself, and the requirement of her to make shifts in who she was. Because if anybody in a community is going to make change and grow, it isn't just that person alone that does it. It's something that we do together. So there's a role for us as educators to also shift who we are in those experiences. It's also a lot of work around awareness. So in this imagining today, Gravity, your question about how often were we thinking about past rather than what could be in the future, I realized that as being a barrier to something that might be stopping me from being able to recognize what I might be causing. So I do very much recommend her book, and she has a TED Talk and a few other places to look for some of that work. And in that work, she's talking about her partnership with her children. And one of the other reasons I chose this quote was because she also uses the word oppressor, and it brings me back to thinking about the work of Freire and others who talked about like considering what our role is as educators in our relationship with children. So next slide, please, Dana. Thank you. So I wanted to just tell a brief story about another person that I've learned about how we can be in new relationship with children and as a community. And one of the adult roles in these communities is initiating the children in that community into the community. So there's a ceremony called the Right of Competence. It's a non-religious ceremony. I learned about it. And I facilitated it. I learned about it from Mark Moray. And what he talks about in the Right of Competence is it's a ceremony for children who are somewhere between the ages of 7 and 9. So think second, third grade. And if you've ever worked with that age group, you know these children are entering into a different time in their life. They're no longer the little kids. There's motor skill ability that is emerging and is new for them. There is language that is new and solidifying, and a lot of these things are starting to come together, and they're seeing themselves in the world in a different way. It's a really important step for us as adults with them to help initiate them into who they're being. So the role of the adult in the Right of Competency ceremony is to observe that child and see how are they emerging, what is coming from them, and how are they stepping into being in the community and the society in a new way. And so we intently watch that. So in school, we do this. We watch kids in terms of their math aptitude or their reading aptitude and all these other ways. But in this setting, we're also watching them very deeply as people, and we're gathering those pieces of seeing who they are as an individual person. So this is this dive into the forest, like each person, like what is this person showing up with and offering? And as the adults, we're taking the time to be really aware of that, and also choosing the things that are going to be supportive of them as a person and supportive of the community. And we gather those things up. Sometimes there's a physical representation of them in the ceremony. So we might be gathering beads to put on a string, or something to tie on a blanket, stones to put in a jar, whatever the physical, we're building something to represent like each one of those little things and the way this child is beginning to show up in the community. And then as part of the ceremony, the community comes together and everyone takes their place in a circle to then reflect how they're seeing that child show up in new ways. And it's a moment to help that child to see, we see you, you're recognized in this community, and you're showing up. But the other side of that is in some ways an orientation. So the child's being oriented to the community to see the way they're showing up in the community. But oftentimes an orientation is seen as like, when you go to college orientation, they're like, this is the way it is here, so get ready for it. But the difference here is that not only are we showing the child how the community is and how they're showing up in the community, but we're also taking a moment to say how we are going to be different because you are showing up in this way. We're saying this is what we can offer you as a member of this community. So we're making a commitment. And in that moment, we are stating as a community that because you are different and because you are changing, we are actually changing too. And that is a step that we are willing to take, and that the ceremony allows us to step into and make that change. And in doing that, that allows us to move in a new direction, potentially to make new choices. And it's another step in showing the people in our community that we're in a partnership together, and that each of those people showing up makes a difference. So Dan, if you could take us to the next slide. So a lot of this in supporting initiation is about supporting us to have an awareness of what's happening by looking at the people, reflecting things back to them, and then allowing us to make new choices. Because without that awareness of that something's happening, we can't make a new choice, and that we want to do that in community. At the end of the last step of the ceremony then is this child now takes on a new role. There was something they may want to have. They may have wanted, like, to be able to have a knife and whittle, or be able to ride their bike into town. Like, they're now prepared. We're able to shift our role to say, okay, I can step away a little bit more in trying into leading your life in this way. Also, this step gives us a framework for, as children grow, to recognize ways of initiating them into community. So I wanted to give some examples of what that might look like, some general examples of what that might look like in the classroom. And then I know Dana is going to even take us even deeper into more specifics. But some of these things in terms of initiating people into community have to do with not just looking at them as individuals, but also talking about our interdependence. So moving from independence to interdependence. And that might look like recognizing that the work that we do in a classroom isn't just by one person, but it's a group. And that in any feedback, reflection, or assessment, we bring in the impact that the things that learning had on the larger group, or to also bring ourselves as the adults into what impact did that have as ourselves. The next thing I wanted to mention was that we want to get to know, claim, and use our voices. And so that when in the ceremony, we're asking our children to see their voices and to see their impact in a new way and reflect that back to them. It makes me think of a colleague who I worked with, who whenever we ran into a challenge with like figuring out, what should we do? How should we do this lesson? The answer was, well, let's ask them. Let's ask the students. The students were very used to being asked, how do we figure this out? And if we couldn't use their suggestion because of some higher up reason, we told them, well, this is why we can't do that. And then from there, they knew the reasoning behind it, and allowing the consequences of whatever they wanted to do happen. I have a picture here of Bodie McBoatface. I don't know if you know the story. I'll just tell it really quickly. Bodie McBoatface was a vessel in the British research fleet, and they asked the internet, what should we call our new boat? We have this beautiful new boat. It's going to be doing all this research around the world. And so the internet said, we should call it Bodie McBoatface. And the boat is now called the Sir David Attenborough. And one of the submersibles, special mention, is now called Bodie McBoatface. And I use this example as oftentimes we do this in school. We offer the illusion of you're going to get to choose. I even remember being in a principal's office where we were doing a vote on something that had to do with the garden, and realizing that this principal reflected back to me, well, we're not actually really going to use the votes. We can choose whichever one. We can't choose the one that had like whatever was in it. I'm forgetting the details because I was so struck by the idea that, we're not actually going to follow the voice of what these children are asking for. And then therefore we're not giving people the opportunity to see their impact on the world and get the feedback, and even have a process for how do we navigate this kind of change. And then the final one in terms of being aware and helping initiate people in the community is to recognize the way we have systemic ways of doing things. So one example is that, if we think about all the 7 and 8-year-olds, we have 60 of them. So we break them into 3 groups of 20 and we put them in a room. And that's in a large way an efficiency. That is in support of a system. But a lot of research shows that that isn't necessarily the only way, or to spend most of your time with only people of your same age throughout day in and day out might not necessarily be the best way to support learning. So offering mixed age experiences and play, if we're aware that this systemic thing is happening, we just do it because we've always done it, can we initiate them into community in a way and partner with them to allow for more of those types of experiences that truly enliven them, allow them to see themselves in reflection in the community and step in and take on those roles? Can we start to offer more of those to them? So to finish up, this really is about recognizing what I'm trying to say is recognize what our partnership is to students. And you can go to my last slide, Dana. Being aware of what our partnership is with them and truly seeing it as a partnership and what roles can we play in that partnership and offering them choice. And so I felt like there was a place for standards but in this conversation, but that clearly we wouldn't start with it. But also to say that in the standards, there is also a hope for this. We often see them as something that we would offer to children. So I've highlighted local here to state that the local is like what's happening in that forest, like right in front of us, the students in front of us, and that the belief that our actions alone or in combination with others, and that as educators that we can bring ourselves into that in combination with others and to really be partnering with students and looking for ways that we can take a role in reflecting what we see back to them and allow them to step into roles that they might not have had a chance to step into before. Thank you.
So I'm going to unmute myself and also just want to say that something that I've been really, really aware of and thinking a lot about is all of the conversation that we've been having and the fact that Zoom fatigue is a real thing. And so I do want to just take maybe 2 minutes for people to step away from their computers, to take some of those deep belly breaths that help to release the cortisol that we know starts to collect, even when we are in an experience that we feel excited about or happy to be in. So I will say that I'm going to begin our next part in 2 minutes at 12:28. But take these 2 minutes if you do want to stand and stretch and breathe and whatever you need to do to kind of take yourself off screen, to go ahead and do that, and we'll come back and So my hope is that you got at least just a smidgen of a moment to stand up, to stretch, to take a deep breath, and that we'll come back together. We'll have another break in about half an hour-ish. So our intention is to also kind of take maybe a couple minutes for you to maybe refreshen your coffee or tea in a little while as well. So what I want to share with you are maybe some of the actionable steps that we might take as we begin thinking about what does this work look like in our schools? What are some of the things that we can plan to do? And what does that look like in terms of the shifts in our schools? So when I began considering this and talking to our team and teachers about this, we started just thinking about, well, where are those shifts? The first 3 that kept popping up were, we want to create shifts in learning, we want to create shifts in environment, and we want to create shifts in community. So we began thinking a little bit about, what do the practices look like right now? And when we think about learning, and we think about maybe our roles in supporting teachers with thinking about learning in their classrooms, often the roles that we have and the things that we're doing with them are things like planning out units week by week, right? And we're doing things like maybe choosing mentor texts and creating pre-designed text sets. And we're thinking about what we might do for personalizing or individualizing learning for students simply based on our own observations, assessments. And so a lot of it feels like it's all in the seat and the role of the teacher to be making all of these decisions about learning. But when we think about trying to create a more democratic school, a school in which students' voices are not only asked, but listened to and heard, what might we do to begin shifting and thinking about those practices in a more democratic way? What does planning look like? And so maybe we might think a little bit about offering students a say in what we actually are going to be teaching them. And there are so many ways we can do this. We can do this by inviting students to think a little bit about just opening up maybe a bigger idea and offering them opportunities to take maybe topic tastings and asking them, what is it that you feel connected to, that you feel like you're interested in? It might be even that week by week design where we're thinking a little bit, and I'm leaning into something that Sarah was sharing, where at the end of the week, instead of being the only one, the one who goes home exhausted because you have spent your entire Friday evening planning the week ahead, or maybe in your coaching time, you spent the whole coaching time just thinking about the mini lessons for next week. What if instead we asked students the question, what do you need? Let's think about the goals and the things that we're studying. What is it that you need? And created our week's plans after that. And maybe coaches and teachers could work together by thinking about the things that the students said and designing opportunities to decide on how can we bring that forward to them. And what might that look like even when we ask students, what do you need? And sign up for a group, for a small group, rather than me making all the decisions about the small group strategies that I'm going to be bringing to groups of students. You know, it sometimes I step back and think, we're doing all of this thinking work and forgetting to ask the people who know best. So can we ask them to consider what they might need for their learning, and to design groups where it could be led by us, or it could also be led by students who feel like they've been very practiced at some of these things and they might be able to be each other's teachers, that it doesn't all need to fall on us. We started thinking a little bit about choosing the way that we celebrate together. What does a celebration look like? What does the celebration of our learning look like at the end of a unit of study? What might it look like as we go week by week? And asking students, how do you want to bring your own learning out to share with others, to share with your community, to share with our classroom? What ways do you want to be able to reflect on your own growth? And so those are things that will help us to create that shift so that student voices are more a part of the learning experience. And I want to say that the things that we're saying here are certainly not the only ones. There's a whole lot of thought and a whole lot of imagining that we probably want to be doing as we move forward, but I'm just going to share a few to kind of get us started. We might also be thinking about environment. And when I think back to even my own classroom practices, on day one, when students walked into my classroom, the entire classroom was set up, right? I created these cute little nooks and crannies. I designed all of these things with them in mind, but I didn't ask them. And I think it was when I was reading Christy Mraz's book, and she talks about how on day one, having the furniture in the middle of the room and just inviting students to think a little bit about what is it that you want this classroom to look like? What types of areas would best support you? How would the seating support the learning that you're envisioning for yourselves? And allowing them to be part of that decision-making, because when they walk into a room that's fully designed, it really isn't a shared space. It's our space that we're inviting them into, but it's not really designed by all. And so we might begin thinking a little bit about allowing them to have more of a say in how we physically set up the room, bringing them into establishing, and I feel like part of things that people say, like, yeah, we make the rules in the first week of school. And that's not what I'm really talking about. I'm talking about when we're talking about establishing norms, what we're doing is we're really asking students what they need. We're letting them have conversations about it, and we're letting them create the environment and go back to again and again and again, a shifting of what they need in order to be able to show up. So that kind of work where it is a constant part of our conversations with them. And even just exploring ways of how they might contribute. This has been something that I've been thinking about a whole lot, right? Where typically when students wanted to contribute something, they raised their hands. Or maybe in some of our classrooms, we might have said, turn and talk, and everybody got a chance to contribute to someone else. But this year, with the work and the environment that we're having with hybrid learning and trying out all of these things and trying to find student voices in online atmospheres and very different looking classrooms, I think I've learned so much from students about ways that they can contribute and what contribution means, right? So might it be that we're contributing with nonverbal cues? Might it be that we're contributing by showing things that we've made? Might it be that we're contributing by adding something to a Jamboard, by using our chat, and wanting to bring some of those more open-minded ways of contribution into tomorrow's classroom when maybe all of the hybrid is not necessarily a part of it, but choice in not only what we say, but how we say it and how we contribute, for me, means that it feels a lot more democratic as a practice. And then lastly, as we think a little bit about shifts in community, we might think about, our schools all have, or at least I'll speak for my own. So my kids' experience is that every year we get a guidebook and that has in it our policies and our rules, and we have to sign off that we've all read it and we understand those. And that's a part of every year that we do that, and it's marked off in Genesis that we've done it, that we agree on all of those things, but what we're agreeing to is something that somebody else has decided already, right? So that doesn't feel democratic to me. What would feel more democratic is, what are the guidelines that we want to create as a school community, and doing that work first rather than signing something that was already made. And even thinking a little bit about our greater communities with PTAs and PTOs and community events, that often those are, and I used to be on the board of our PTA in my kids' school, and there's a lot of work, I can promise you, and a lot of late nights where, PTA members are imagining all of these things that could happen for students to enrich their school experience. And again, going back to asking the kids what they want, asking the kids what they need, asking them what kinds of community contributions they might want, instead of, setting up food drives for things that we feel like are important. Who do students want to contribute to? What things feel important to them that they want to make those contributions to? So all this to say that what we want to be thinking about are, what are our actionable steps? Imagine first, what types of shifts are we thinking about? And these are 3, but there are many more. So we're saying, again, imagine what shifts you might think through too. Consider first, what does this look like already? Or what might this have looked like yesterday? And then how might we change that with all that we've learned about and thought about in terms of democratic practices? And so these are possibilities, but it's also a way to think about it. I also want to share, I know that Gravity was talking this morning about Izzy Tawhid and talking a bit about the work that she has done in classrooms. And I was reminded of a beautiful blog post, and such an important blog post that she wrote about what policing looks like in schools. And something that stood out so much to me was this truth that she spoke. And it's a truth that I want to just acknowledge. Some of these things were happening in my classroom. And so I want to own that. I feel like it was true that I had behavior management systems and things like that. And I wish I could go back and change that, but I don't have that as an opportunity, but what I can do is I can step forward, more knowledgeable, understanding better, and thinking about how I could shift that practice. So when I think about what she was saying in classroom, policing is often cleverly masked behind those color-coded charts, those apps that many people use with those avatars and point systems, the weekly trips to the prize box, all things that were happening for me. But as we reflect on it, what is that really doing? Is that just about us controlling kids? Is it about our schools controlling kids? And the messages that we can send without even opening our mouths, and the way that we hold our bodies, the way that we position ourselves around with students, if we're always towering over them, or if we're ever sitting with them as equals. When we think about the language choices of things like need to, have to, and the way that that positions us, in even the way that we just use our tone of voice, and in some of those little things that we might be dangling to get kids to do things that doesn't feel very democratic, that feels like a way of tricking them into doing what we have centered and valued. And so those are some things that I've been thinking a lot about. I do want to invite a few student voices in and then have us have an opportunity to have a quick conversation. So one of the things that I was just interested in is from the students that I know, from some kids that I encounter, what their thoughts were on how they had voice in school. And so we simply asked them the question, how do you have a voice in your school community? And these are some of the things that they said. Some of them were just sharing things like their school doesn't ask them to make any decisions. Sometimes they were feeling like, oh, my teacher lets us vote on things, and they let them vote on things like the read aloud that might be read to them, or how the class party that they might have. Some of them were feeling like they got choice boards for homework and things like that. And so they felt like they had somewhat of a say. And yet when we look at two, there seems to be a little bit of a difference, or at least a noticing of mine was that the higher up in education that we go, that the less students feel like they have a say in what their education is like. And so when we look at what some of the students were saying in middles and high schools, that there is a student council, but that's kind of like what we were talking about before, where it's this fake sense of asking for their thoughts or opinions. And then also when we think about who gets to be on that student council, are those voices representative of the whole school community, or is that a small group that's kind of got that privilege of being able to do some of that? And so these are the ways that our students are feeling about how they're being asked to be representative in their schools. And what it meant for me is simply that it seems like we have a lot of work ahead of us. And so I'd love for all of you to kind of take a minute to think a little bit about the shifts and some actionable steps, what's resonating with you right now, and how, as in your role as a coach, or maybe as a school leader, or maybe some of us are classroom teachers, and whatever role that might be for you, how might you be able to support those shifts? So I'll put us back into our breakout rooms, and I'm going to say, let's take 5 minutes to just have some conversations with each other. And then when we'll come back, we're going to try out one way that it also might work to bring an actual democratic practice into our schools. So welcome back, everyone. I hope that you were able to kind of think a little bit together and imagine what shifts you might take as some first steps. I also wanted to share a structure that might be supportive in doing some of this work in our classrooms. So something that has been a real interest of mine in, I'm going to say the last year or so, have been restorative practices. And for those of you who are not super familiar with them, essentially restorative practices are a way that communities can come together when harm has been caused in order to heal and move forward. Something that they also provide us with, though, and especially the circle aspects of restorative practices, are they provide us with an opportunity to come together and share perspective. They provide us with an opportunity to hear each other and to become a stronger community. And so for me, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how circle practices might be an opportunity for us to have a more democratic structure that we can add to our classroom practices. So here's the way that they might work. When we are thinking about decision making, when we are thinking about talking about problems, when we are thinking about even doing a deep dive into a text that we've read, one way that we can come to that conversation is by having students come together into a circle. We can even do them in a digital format. So we're going to practice that today. And what they will allow us to do as students come together into a circle is we ask a question and have students reflect, and they share that response as equals. Being in a circle where everyone's voice is heard allows us to make sure that nobody's higher than anyone else. Everyone is able to bring their thought into it. It's a safe space, but also a place that we can be brave. We can all see each other, and every voice is contributed or contributing something. And so what we would do is establish some of our circle guidelines. For our purposes, I'll say these are ones that are often talked about and used, that when we come together into a circle and we're talking together, that it isn't a conversational flow. It's a question, reflection, and then each voice that gets a chance to speak and contribute to the community. When we do this, our guidelines are that we're speaking from our heart and we're listening from our heart, that we're open to other people's experiences, perspectives, and are willing and ready to acknowledge those, that we might trust in what we know, that we'll know what we might say will feel okay. And especially important is that in a circle, there are often times that people are revealing things that feel deeply personal to them. And so whatever is said in the circle stays in the circle. So some basic circle guidelines that will just allow people to add a contribution and to show up. But we might think about how we can talk about problems that are happening in our schools and problem solve in that way. That we might be able to make some decisions about ways that learning might go in our classroom communities, make decisions in that way. And in a circle, it isn't necessarily that we have to come to an agreement, that everybody agrees on the same thing. But what is important is that what we're trying to do is understand that the decision that we're making is what's good for the community as a whole, and that we can hear and understand each other. So I thought that something that we could do is just try out a circle together. And it again is inspired by that blog post by Izzy Tawheed. What I would love for people to do is to think a little bit about, will this question or this set of questions, how might we be policing students in their own homes right now? How might we be sending messages that it's okay to attempt to control students' language, students' bodies, expressions, or identity? And thinking about the classrooms and larger extended classrooms that we might be experiencing right now, what might we see based on something that maybe is a policy or something that is happening in classrooms? And just think about that and maybe jot for just a moment. And I'd love for a couple of people to just volunteer who might share their thinking or their experience. We're going to do this not as a full circle, but as a fishbowl, where it's a few people who are going to be contributing and everybody else gets to just listen and think about and reflect on what's said. So if you don't mind sharing some of your thoughts, I'd love for you to just put your name in the chat and I'll add you to our circles. So I'll have just one more moment to kind of think a little bit about that, reflect on that, or jot about that. And then the way that a circle will work is one person will go. This time we're going to go just around. So it won't be going back and forth, but just right around the circle. We'll start with Paul and move to Gravity and around that way. In this circumstance, because we're not all physically together, and usually we use some sort of talking stick to help us. Instead, I'll just ask that people say, please, I'm stepping forward. And then when you're done with your contribution, I step back. And so let me go back to full presentation. And I'm not going to participate in the circle. So I'm just going to say I'm inviting Paul to step forward.
So I think one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about is from an article that Brad had actually shared, and it was talking about administrators' sort of perspectives on civics and like and thinking about conversations that are happening right now regarding a lot of the various sort of like you know just social issues more generally, and how being in distance learning models and hybrid learning models has almost, you know, the sentiment from some of these administrators and principals was almost that it was kind of giving them safety from having from their classrooms to have to grapple with these really tough issues regarding things like identity and oppression. And I think about the thing that Gravity had typed, and I think it was something that Jigisha may have said during the group, but thinking about, you know, who is allowed to be sort of comfortable, who is given that comfort, and the way that we're sort of policing the way that we're able to talk about identity and oppression within these online communities. I think that for teachers generally, there's a lot of insecurity and anxiety around who's going to be in that room, right? Are parents hearing this? How are families going to hear when all of a sudden these classrooms are in their kitchens and in their living rooms, right? There's this sort of like policing, whether it's explicit or implicit, about being able to have those open conversations and having students being vulnerable about their experiences. So yeah.
So, Paul, what you were saying, something resonated with me, that sometimes when we feel like a lot is out of our control, instead of like leaning into that and thinking and rethinking new ways of doing things, we try to exert more control over what's happening. And I think sometimes the anxiety that we all feel being in such a new and challenging situation as educators has resulted sometimes in protocols with not too much flexibility. So I'm thinking, of course, about like camera on, camera off types of ideas. You know, I know that even my own children are in situations where they're supposedly not, I had to get special permission when one of my kids was on medication and feeling ill to have water or a snack near the computer. Kids being questioned when they go to use the bathroom in their own home sometimes during remote learning. And I think about just like when we imagine basic human needs of like food, water, and shelter, and how that is being policed in some ways, perhaps not intentionally or with the intent that it's having on students, but what the results of that are during these times.
I'm just going to jump in for just a moment to say there are multiple ways that we can do circles. We can do it so that as one person finishes, somebody who feels ready can join in. So for the sake of this one, I'm just going to say, let's just go around, and what we'll do is we'll go Gravity, Heather, Nicole, Jigisha, if that feels okay.
I'll step forward. Thanks, Dana. So yeah, a lot of what's already been said is resonating, and I'm thinking about my own experience this year, not just as a consultant, but teaching at the college level, and how I decided not to abide by the policies I was given, which was that my students needed to have their cameras on, which was that I should be lenient, but I needed to take points off if students handed in things late. And there was sort of this very mixed message of keep the expectations the same, but be more empathetic. And what I realized was all of that was centering policies, not centering students. And so in my classroom, I was uncomfortable in my classroom, my virtual screen classroom. I was uncomfortable every day because I never ever had a class where everybody had their cameras on. It was really uncomfortable. And I would just acknowledge that. I would start the session by saying, like, this is really hard for me. And so if you're comfortable, I would love for you to turn your camera on. If you're not, it's just going to be hard for me. Like, and that's what it is, right? And when students handed things in late or didn't do things at all, they would apologize to me, and like I would meet with them and I would say, this work is not for me, it's for your own learning. Is there an alternative experience you could have that would give you the learning? Like, let's talk about that. And I name these things not to say that I've gotten it right, because I can think, Dana, what you were saying about like policing students through charts. Like, I had the color coded charts. I was like given that and told to do that by my principal when I was a new teacher, right? But I think it comes back for me a couple of things. Like, I really do, and I got to hear Jagisha give a short keynote this summer about this idea of like, whose comfort are we centering, right? Right, and that is really a question I ask often, and I ask it of teachers when I support teachers. And I think the second part of that is, as a white educator, there are so many ways that it has been okay for me to be oppressive of students because it's part of my privilege. So I alone cannot see things. So I think the other ways for me is to be constantly getting perspectives from multiple people, whether those are students, whether those are colleagues, whether those are reading, and not like, am I going to be using privilege and colonial practices? Yes, because that is how I've been taught to be an educator, but instead, how can I recognize more of them? And how can I say, I'm going to make a different choice? And part of that for me is saying the fact that my identity as a white educator impacts everything, like naming that out loud, because it is okay for white educators to police because that is part of the inherent privilege of being white. It is not okay for everybody to have that in this country. And so anyway, I could go on and on and on. I'm just going to say, thanks for asking the question. I have more questions and answers, and I'll step back. So if Heather wants to share next.
I step forward. In addition to what everyone shared, something that came to mind in terms of ways that we're policing students is how much of these policies or how much of the classroom practices are tied to perhaps conceptions or misconceptions around what we think a active citizen or an active participant in a school looks like, right? And how, I've often heard from some teachers this year that the students who show up to virtual learning in dressed up and not in their sweatpants and not in their pajamas, or the students who show up and have a learning space that very much mirrors or mimics what the classroom looks like. The students who are not sitting in their couches with a pet nearby or a stuffed animal nearby are the students we're valuing, and we are often explicitly saying that out loud to them. And I was just thinking particularly around learning environments, how perhaps in our best intentions to support caregivers and grown-ups and students in managing what this learning has looked like and all of its challenges, then in offering some ideas for what learning environments might look like and how they might be set up and structured at home is maybe a form of policing. And maybe it's a form of pushing our values in terms of what we think an ideal learning environment is, or what we think an effective learning environment is, onto the students we work with. So I'll step back.
I'll step forward. A lot of what Heather and Gravity said has resonated with me. It's actually a conversation I've been having a lot with some of our virtual teachers about like, what does it kind of mean to be an active participant in a virtual classroom? And do we need to see students' faces for them to be an active participant? And I've been working really closely with a particular teacher on this because there's one student in particular where she feels like she doesn't know if he's really there because his camera is always off. And we've been talking about like, well, does it have to be on? And how can you know that he's there? And how can you know that he's participating? But so as a teacher, when I've come in and co-taught with her, like I have felt that I was comfortable with him having his camera off because he would send me a message in his chat, or when we went into private breakout rooms, if I joined his breakout room, he would turn his camera on and like wave to me and let me know he was there. But then the flip side of that is, as someone who works with teachers, and while I was leading a professional development, I found myself very uncomfortable when the teachers had their camera off. And so like, it's just very interesting seeing it from both sides. And so I can understand that discomfort that Gravity was talking about. And it was interesting to me, like it challenged my own thinking, like how am I okay with this with students, but why am I feeling uncomfortable when it's adults that have their camera off? And am I not extending, like, am I policing them by wanting to see their faces? And so it's just some like internal work that I have to do and figure out like the answers to that for myself. And with that, I will step back.
So I will step forward, and in just what everybody else has shared too, I absolutely resonate with so much of what was said in Gravity, and how you shared like there's more questions than answers. I think similarly as well, like thinking about the broader systemic issues around some of this policing of students at home, and thinking about how, of course, this is completely unprecedented times in education, but also who's deciding what we consider like the dominant and conventional ways to do remote learning and teaching, and deciding like, you know, should students have their cameras on or off, or the distractions around them. But also I've been reading this book, I think I shared with my group, but Is Everyone Equal? And really talking about what are the norms surrounding the dominant group? And in this case, what is that? And who is that? Is it the students who have the opportunity and the privilege to have a space that there aren't distractions, or that they can have their screens on without feeling like, you know, I need to have a background up? Or is that something that's allowed to be okay, as it should be? And I think the other part too of what we're seeing is there's so much that we're learning more about our students in these times, because often the avenue of remote teaching is opening up a bigger space for the students who might not always feel seen and heard. But again, there's a counter to that as well, where there's spaces that students don't feel seen and heard in that. And I think, you know, I have been teaching a class at a college as well, and not requiring the students to have their screens on, and they're all still adults in that case. But how one of my students shared with me that it's really about, are we creating a point of access for students to, is their education accessible to them? And that's really like centering that work, not about the other components of how that looks, but what are we doing to create that pathway? So same thing, more questions than answers, but with that, I step back.
So I just want to say that I'm so grateful that all of you shared your thinking and your reflections around those questions that were really, really hard, and not necessarily even like hard to answer, but hard to kind of name, and hard truths to kind of just share, you know, about our profession and about what feels uncomfortable about the situations that we're in, and things that we're really considering as we move forward. So thank you for doing that. And I just want to invite you to think about how you might use a structure that's similar to that in circles, to invite teachers to share their thinking and their perspective, to invite students to share their thinking and their perspective. So let's do a 3-minute quick coffee break. So It doesn't have to be coffee for you. It can be tea, it can be water, it can be just a stand and stretch. We'll come back in 3 minutes, and then Heather and Pam are going to bring us through some text experiences that I'm looking forward to.
Yep. Dana, do you want me to wait a few more minutes for people to pop back on? Or just assume people want cameras off for now?
I didn't hear if you directed that at me.
I did.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's totally up to you. I feel like people are probably trickling back in. So you feel free to give them a moment if you feel like that would be better.
Okay.
Yeah, I would give people 2 more minutes.
Yeah.
You got it. I'll wait 1 more minute. Then we'll get started. Okay, so as a disclaimer, Pam and I are showing up to this work imperfectly. And she and I have been thinking through some of those learning shifts that Dana spoke about earlier. And we were reflecting not only on our time and our work with teachers and school leaders, but also our time in the classrooms when we were teachers. And we recognized that there were practices and commitments that we made that we feel comfortable with, including ensuring that the literature that we used in the classrooms or that we invited students to read represented different voices and perspectives that we might not normally hear from. And you know, Pam and I, who are overthinkers, if you know us, asset and perhaps a fault, have been really grappling lately with some of our practices and considering whose voices we were centering or whose experiences we were valuing. And so we're not here to say that our way of thinking is the best way or even the right way or the only way to shift practices. Instead, what we're hoping is that we can give you a glimpse into our messy process. I mean, even as of this morning, we were tweaking and shifting and refining some of our thinking. And we will invite you to try out some of this work in your breakout rooms a little bit later. And the reason for the shift in our practices is that Pam and I recognize that inaction is a privilege. And we're really looking to disrupt that in our own practices and in our collective practices. So Pam's going to share a little bit more about some of the work we've been trying out together.
Dana, we could go ahead to the next slide. So besides being overthinkers, one of the other things that Heather and I share is a love of all things children's literature. And so much of the time, we know that we already feel the time crunch, right? Even before this circumstance. And we want to be reminded that this work is never extra. This work is part of what you're doing. This work is part of everything that's existing in the classroom and the learning that's happening, but it's a refinement and an enhancement and a rethinking and a reimagining of those ideas. So if we want to make change, we can ground tiny yet mighty and consistent changes in the work that's happening and think about how we could use that as a foundation. So if we know that creating change requires making changes at all points in the process, one of the first things, of course, that we want to consider is text selection. So many of us might have audited our libraries or reconsidered books that we're using for read alouds, etc. And this, of course, is a really important step. But I want to point out that part of what Heather and I really believe is that is a step, and it's not the final destination. It's kind of the precursor and the foundation to the work that then follows. So we want to start with recreating with what we're consuming in the classroom. And when we do that, we want to, of course, consider community. We want to consider not only really kind of opening it up and including new voices and own voices, literature in the classroom and texts in the classroom, but also thinking about processes of students and accessibility and interests and identities of students in the classroom. And part of what we could do along those lines is to consider multimodal text layering, right? Because some of us might prefer images or infographics or poetry. Some might like fiction texts or narratively written texts. Some might prefer videos or podcasts. So we think about ways that we can intentionally and strategically layer texts to foster that accessibility, to foster students' engagement and interest, and it help students really co-create even some of that experience as well. Zaretta Hammond talks a lot about helping us see that our job is to help students activate their learning. And one small part of this would be the texts that we access and what it is that we're consuming in the classroom. So Heather and I began to put, we could have gone forever probably, some introductory text sets together that kind of represent that intentional multimodal layering. And we're going to share these with you, and you're going to do some work with the ones you're interested in today. So even with this one text set, there's so much we could do. And what immediately came to our mind as we were cultivating were ideas around ableism and inclusivity, and how we can use even reading, writing, word study, grammar, social studies beyond work to also be getting in the work that we really want to be incorporating in the classroom regularly with civics. So Dana, we could go to the next slide. And here we see another text set that prominently features some traditions, and we were thinking about the importance of not stepping away, but really centering and celebrating, right? The members of our communities, their family traditions, their identities, and thinking about the joy inherent in these processes and using them to spur upcoming learning. We think a lot about verbifying the texts that we use, right? Because it's the way that we use them, the process in which we engage with texts, and the actions that we take while consuming texts and then creating because of the interactions with those texts that really is going to matter. So when we start, we can co-create these text sets with the people in our community, whether we're working with children or we're working with grown-ups, right? So whether we're thinking classroom work, school community work as coaches, we want people to be part of this creation process. We want to enhance what we do because we know that together we are better. And this important part of this is to know that as much as I might love this particular text set, it can't be replicated, because if I'm ever doing this experience with somebody else, we need to co-create and enhance this together as well, right? So it's not predetermined. It can't be replicated from one room to the next, or 1 year to the next, or one period to the next, because it's been really cultivated by the people within the community and sharing in that context together. We know that our district units and even state standards are malleable, right? And we think about this, I wrote recently in a blog, they come to life in the way we enact them in the classroom. And everyone that's in that room or in that Zoom or part of the community has a part in making this happen. And we also want to think about expanding that community beyond the school. So we can think about how we can involve others from the town, from the district and beyond to be a part of the learning as well. And I think Heather's going to share a couple more with us now too. So we could go to the next slide, Dina.
So Dr. Gholdy Muhammad in her book, Cultivating Genius, speaks to the idea that reading and writing are not passive acts, that literacy requires and involves action. So it's not enough to simply support our students in writing persuasive letters and then having them sit in a writing folder or having them sit in a Google Drive folder, right? There has to be some sort of action that has the capacity to improve our communities. So Pam and I, as we were thinking that through, created a text set around teen change makers. People that you may know, like Malala and Greta, and also some more local stories that you may not have heard of, in which teens are taking action to improve the lives of those around them. And Dana, you can also advance to the next slide if you don't mind. And so what does it look like to take action as opposed to just ingesting or discussing these text sets? Well, Pam and I were thinking about invitations and provocations, ways to co-construct learning experiences with students or with adults that lean into their wonderings and their noticings about the community and world and their interests. And so they can be open-ended experiences, but also connected to some of the ideas that Gholdy Muhammad talks about in her book around identity, community, action, and even joy. Perhaps there are opportunities to deconstruct some practices or texts, to reconstruct them in a more democratic way, as we talked about earlier, and then find a way to act on it to bring about change in our local communities or shifts in practice. So we're going to go back to Pam, and she's going to invite us to consider different ways that we might use these text sets or things we might consider when using these types of text sets with adults and with children.
And as we go to the next slide, Dana, you'll see probably something hopefully right away when this slide pops up, which is, earlier today we were talking about sometimes an adultist perspective in doing certain work, but many of us who are educators have also felt at certain points in our own career, like people are asking us to do something in our classroom, but we're not being considered that same way in our own learning and in our professional learning as well. So we really wanted to talk about how this type of process is very similar, no matter the age or the profession or the setting that we might want to be in. We want to include the same grace, and we want to make sure that the learning that happens, whether it's classroom learning, professional learning, or beyond, is relevant and meaningful for the people who are partaking in it. So I think about like a new kind of the 4 C's, right? Where we can create and come together with the community to see what are the issues or what are the things around us that we're most first and foremost on our mind, and then co-create those text sets by strategically layering high quality, credible, accessible, interesting sources. And then we're going to consume for our second C, right? Where we learn about the topic, we discuss the topic, we hear different perspectives and voices on the topic, and move away from a singular story to really kind of have a full-bodied understanding of what it is that feels so relevant. Then we get into the create stage, where we begin to think about how we could take action and what actions we're going to take and how that's going to look, so that we are indeed contributing to our own learning, each other's learning, and hopefully beyond, because it's about moving beyond the immediate community as well. So what are we going to do to contribute? And then how are we going to share that out with others to even spur continued action outside of us? We want to think about the big potential of the synergy that begins to happen when we create this kind of culture of learning, and know that what we do in the classroom and the ways that we invite students in, we can do the same thing as coaches and as building leaders in our work with colleagues as well. So in order to get into this a little bit today, since we are a co-op, right, and we like to build things together, we're going to go to the next slide, Dana, and we'd like to invite you in your breakout rooms to do a few things today. And I'm going to add some points to the chat. But one of the first things we'd like you to do is decide on one of those text sets that you just saw that has some sort of immediate appeal for you, something that you're drawn to automatically. So which text set do you want to focus on? We had 4 different ones that we showed. And then we're going to ask you to make a copy of that, a document that's aligned with that text set that's in the folder I just shared. And I'll share this again. And we're going to ask you, we're inviting you to think about how you might use that, how you might enhance that, what might come up. And if you'd like some direction, you can make this what you'd like to make it. But if you'd like some direction, we like to offer you these collaborative inquiries as ways that could direct and focus some of the time and the work that you do with your group. And I'm adding those to the chat as well, so that when we do go into breakout rooms, you might not be able to see the slide, but you have those inquiry invitations kind of among you. So if you open the folder, you'll see 4 documents. 1 are for each text set. Again, you're going to make a copy and talk with your group about what you'd like to do with this, or reimagine how you can use this to spur the kind of action that we're talking about. When we come back, we're going to invite 1 person from each breakout room to briefly contribute and share out some of the key takeaways from your experience. So
myself, hi Carolyn.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for taking that very short time to look more closely and think more deeply about some of the text sets that Pam and I pulled together for these purposes. Just really quickly, I want to reiterate that we spent the time thinking through what those layered text sets might look like to show you an example of our thinking and our process. They're not meant to be the be all end all. They're not meant to be ones that you use or that you have to use. But as you see in the docs, there's a space for you to add on and build and co-create with other people or with the people that you worked with today. So to be mindful of everyone's time, we do want to spend just a quick amount of time sharing either your group's thoughts or wonderings or realizations from your conversations. And so what I'm going to invite 1 person from each group to do is to give us the Steve Jobs elevator pitch version of what you talked about in your groups. So imagine that the time it takes to get from one floor to another is all you have to share your brightest and your most impactful and inspiring ideas from your breakout groups. So I will open it up to you for whoever is willing to share.
I'll start. We took a closer look at the Teen Change Makers text set, which I thought was really, really great, because in my mind and to the group, we were thinking that the students can see themselves in this work when you look at it through the lens of another, like essentially a student or person of their age, right? And when you make it like real for them, like these are real people, Greta's a real person, Malala's a real person, right? Like, and then we were thinking about how we can actually take a closer look and add text from local community, like from students in their area that have made change, right? And have taken action. Because I think that that's part of the work too, is seeing themselves as members of a greater community and seeing their place within it and making that better. So I think we made it to floor 2.
Thanks, Dan.
Our group was looking at text set 2, which was celebrating and centering sharing the joy of family and community traditions. And we felt like there were a lot of opportunities with this text set to invite students to share about their own traditions and their own celebrations, that they could easily like interview primary sources and other people in their lives and conduct their own research. And that they could share their work in a variety of ways, whether it's a recipe, a story, an article, a podcast that they're writing, to kind of share their own traditions.
Thanks, Nicole.
Hi, I can go. Carolyn and I looked a little bit at the thread, the book set for Learning by Doing. And we just talked about how the books and the images on that text set showed a group of community members who are sharing ideas, learning how to collaborate, agree and disagree, risk take. And there looks like there's a lot of choice and materials to show that different ways that they can demonstrate their own learning and kind of show who they are as a person and their strengths.
Thank you, Jen.
So our group talked about the text set, the Teen Changers text set. And so because we were invited to do this as Steve Jobs' elevator pitch, I sort of just was playing a little bit around like writing this like as a commercial. So I'll sort of read to you what I came up with in the few minutes I had to think about it. I said, imagine inviting kids to think about causes that really matter to them, really connect to who they are and what they care about. Then empowering them to use their voice to make real change, all while teaching them the skills and strategies in the curriculum that your district has adopted. So I just sort of wrote it that way, like really feeling as if, and I think we talked about just how authentic, shifting the product or shifting the purpose of their writing for students can be in terms of, just really creating truly engaging, authentic, writing projects and really seeing the why, helping kids see the why behind why we even spend time at school learning how to do this kind of writing. And also just the beauty of it is the immediate feedback, the authentic feedback beyond just their peers giving them compliments, which obviously is valuable as well. But imagine hearing back from, a professional basketball player or a big corporation, how empowering that can be for kids. I think we all sort of felt energy ourselves in like thinking about the possibilities for that. And then naturally seeing how what we already teach sort of can naturally be really woven into that very seamlessly. So.
Thank you, Lori, for sharing for our group.
Yeah, you bet.
Our group also looked at the purposeful play, the text set that had purposeful play, the text set 4, and we talked about using it with the adults in kids' lives and really back to school nights or kindergarten orientation, and then what can play look like at home, making a bridge between at home learning and school learning and play, and then almost doing a in defensive play, because we talked about how we have families who are all about, oh, this is great, you have play in your classroom, and other families who are not as supportive.
Thank you, Lori.
Our group also talked about the team change makers, and I think we really spoke about the same thing that I think Daniel mentioned with his group, that it's important for kids to see themselves in the text, and that we would also think it'd be great to layer in like a lot of like nonfiction, like newspaper articles, things like that, things that, had to do with local teens. Like I think there was like an article about something going on in like Livingston schools. Like we imagine this was maybe one you put together for like Livingston, and that it would be great to have things for whatever local school, whatever your school was. And also I thought it was interesting that in our group, Amy's school uses a text set like this in social studies class, and how this could be like a collaborative kind of cross study project that, or book study between social studies and ELA.
Thanks, Tara. Is there anyone else who hasn't shared who wanted to? I see our group is dwindling as the time goes on, so I just want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to say what they want to say. Dana, I'll pass it back to you then.
Okay, so thank you so much. And we're gonna close in just a minute, but before we do, we wanted to just have you be aware of some of our upcoming dates and places that we have teammates that are speaking. So there's a lot of different opportunities to continue to join us coming up. One tomorrow, and then more as we move through all the way through June. So these will be, the links are all there and they'll be shared with you through the slides later on, along with a recording of our work today together. And so I just want to take this opportunity to close us up and have us end this conversation, but certainly not end this work. This was, I feel like, a beginning for many people to just think a little bit about how we can create change. And so Gravity had us thinking this morning about the idea of what if, and she showed us a little bit about how that might go by bringing us into her home with Leo. And so what I would love for us to kind of consider as we step away and back out into our school communities and our home communities and town communities, I'd love for us to think a little bit about just imagining the what if. So it might be, what if I dismantle something? What if I go with that Leo kaboom, right? What change would come of that? And then, or what if I create something new? What if I create something that we haven't, or not I, but what if we came together to create something that school hasn't been yet? I would love for you to just take one moment to think about what's your big what if question based on our conversation today. In a moment, I'll give us a moment to, we'll end with the waterfall, just like Gravity began with it. What's the what if question that we're bringing back? On the count of three, I'm just going to invite everybody to put that in and just go ahead and press enter. I'm going to finish typing mine in too. Awesome. So thank you so much, everyone. We're so glad that you joined us today. We look forward to continuing to see you at other events and continuing to learn with you. And we hope that you had a good experience collaborating with us and with each other.
Bye, everybody. Thanks. Great to see you.